This is a review of the 1999 Patrice Leconte film Girl on the Bridge, which stars Vanessa Paradis and Daniel Auteuil. We have talked about a couple of other Daniel Auteuil movies on this channel. There's some good ones out there. Vanessa Paradis, interesting piece of trivia, was in a relationship with Johnny Depp for a while, and they have a child together, no longer together. That is not to qualify or contextualize her career, but just as an interesting piece of trivia. This movie, Girl on the Bridge, is a special movie, a magical movie that I strongly recommend you watch. I will explain exactly what I mean by special and magical. At least I'll try to, and I'll do it with the aim of convincing you to watch this movie, because this is a pretty good movie, and a movie that has, I think, fairly general appeal. This movie is a little bit more popular than the average thing I review on this channel. It has around 13,000 votes on IMDb, I think, and is rated 7.5 maybe, which is pretty low, to be honest. This is really a great, fun movie that I would recommend. So one of the first things about this movie is that it's unpredictable. This is one of its main virtues. Before we get into anything about the plot, anything about the story, or anything like that, this movie is unpredictable. And that comes out in a number of ways. First of all, the storyline, literally, is unpredictable. The things that happen in the movie you won't expect exactly. But also sort of the way the storyline is structured, or in other words, the pace, or the kinds of things that happen are unpredictable, which makes it hard not only to guess the outcome, but also to guess what sort of conflicts might emerge or how they might be resolved, right? There's one form of unpredictability, which is which way will the coin toss? There's another form of unpredictability, which is the coin being snatched out of the air by an eagle or something like that, or where we'll even flip a coin at all, roll a die, or whatever. This movie is on the sort of latter option in terms of unpredictability. It's unpredictable. The characters, they're unpredictable. What are they going to do? What sort of people are they? Kind of hard to know. The dramatic logic itself and the way the story is told is also a bit unpredictable. There's a scene, for instance, where they are rushing somewhere, talking to somebody really quickly, things are happening, and then the movie sort of pauses for a second. Daniel Auteuil's character halts everything and says, hold on a minute, I'll give you an example. And he waits for a fly that's on the ceiling to come and leave the ceiling and fly down and land on the table in front of them to make his point. This is just a completely out of the blue sort of dramatic mechanism of this weird sort of parable almost of the fly or something like this coming out of nowhere. There's also other unpredictable elements, such as potentially supernatural powers or some elements of magical realism, something along those points. Basically, everything goes in this movie, and I think you get the idea. It's hard to see exactly what will come. And one other final note about unpredictability is that it's not just, there's some movies, for instance, the Denis Villeneuve film Enemy has an extremely unpredictable ending, but you would not predict that it has an unpredictable ending unless you knew about it ahead of time. Now you know, sorry about that. What do I mean by this? Well, it's just sort of a normal movie, kind of, and then the ending is extremely odd and out of the blue. That's one kind of experience, but another kind of experience is the fun of being in a movie where weird stuff is happening left, right, and center. You don't know what to expect. That's an extra kind of fun when you know a movie is going to be unpredictable early on, and then it's clear that you're off the territory, off the map, watching a different kind of movie, and you should prepare for the unexpected, and that's what this is. But this is a very abstract virtue, has almost nothing to do with what actually happens. So we will get into that. Before we get to the story, though, there's a little bit more to talk about. For one is the style. So this is a hugely, hugely stylish movie. This film, by the way, falls basically into the category of quirky French film. Some people who've seen only a handful of newer French films might think that all French films are quirky films like Amélie or Jean-Pierre Jeunet's other work, or Michel Gondry or something like that. But in fact, this is just one genre, one subset of French movies that is, I think, a relatively recent thing, unless you go all the way back to maybe poetic realism or something was quirky too, in maybe a similar sort of way. I don't know. But the point is, this movie is hugely influenced, probably by some of Jean-Pierre Jeunet and Marc Carra's early work, such as Delicatessen and especially City of Lost Children. This film, in the soundtrack, Girl on the Bridge, the soundtrack actually borrows a song written by Angelo Badalamenti, who wrote a bunch of the music for these kinds of movies, also did some of the music for Twin Peaks and a bunch of other interesting stuff. But one of the songs he wrote for City of Lost Children is in this movie and is used as a pivotal song a number of times. So clear influence there. Like I said, quirky. That goes hand in hand with the unpredictability, but it also maybe gives you a sense of what kind of style this movie is going to have. So the style is all over the place, really interesting. In some ways, it's a retro movie, but it's not retro style, as in it doesn't look like an old movie, but it kind of looks like a movie filmed in a back in time or something like that. So much so that there's one scene where a credit card is requested, and you do a double take thinking, what? Credit cards? And then you realize, oh, right, it's 1999. Of course there are credit cards. But it's got kind of this retro feel. It's also got all kinds of interesting techniques. Like I said, you get, macro shots, extreme close-ups of the fly at one point. There's an interesting shot, a subtle thing maybe, but there's an interesting shot later on where there's a bunch of people standing on a hill. I think this is in Turkey. And the camera is angled. There's a street that's on a hill, and there's a bunch of people standing on the sidewalk. The camera is level with the street. So you can't, it looks like the street is level, but all the people are standing tilted a little bit to the side, which is a subtle but interesting sort of technique that has a very clear ramifications for how you might feel and think watching that scene. This, I mentioned, partly takes place in Istanbul, partly takes place in France. I think they stop over in Greece for a little bit. This movie really takes place all over the place, which is another thing that creates this sort of quirky and unpredictable style. It is kind of a whirlwind tour through Europe. Okay, so that's all the fun stuff about the style and just the kind of movie this is. Now to talk about some actual literal things. This movie starts with an interview that's somewhat disconnected from the rest of the movie, and in some ways I think could actually be cut out of the movie, and maybe it's slightly anachronistic too. I'll talk about it a little bit more later, I think. But after you get this interview, which also maybe doubles as the opening credits to some degree, so maybe that's part of the point, you get a girl on a bridge planning to leave the bridge quickly to enter the river for the purpose of ending it all. And she is greeted by a man, Daniel Ote, who's come there to recruit. Now, I will say, this is an unpredictable movie, and I kind of don't want to tell you anything about the movie, and just leave it at that. But I am going to go a little bit further, talk about it a little bit, because there's a lot of sort of analytical meat to be had here that doesn't compromise the film too much. These are things you'll learn very early on, and that I think would be good to talk about. But you don't need to know this to watch the movie or anything, and if anything, maybe you should go watch the movie and then come back and listen to it, if you could bear investing that much time. But point is, I will reveal a couple of things that maybe the purist would say you shouldn't know anything about this movie, and I would generally get behind that. But like I said, there's a lot to be gained from talking about a few things. So who does she meet? Well, she meets a knife thrower who comes to the bridge to recruit. He's looking for an assistant, and being a knife thrower's assistant, having the knives thrown at you, is relatively dangerous. So this man cleverly recruits women off bridges, desperate people. He gives them a lifeline, and in exchange, they let him throw knives at them, basically, as some sort of circus performance, traveling act, or whatever. So Daniel Ote is, one way or another, able to recruit Vanessa Paradis' character here, and they become this troupe or whatever. One sort of theme, stylistically, in some ways, this movie, I think, could be described as a manic-depressive film. It's not that this movie is about any specific mental condition or anything like that. But I already mentioned the style. I already mentioned the unpredictability of it all. The swings in this movie, the deep sort of distress at the beginning and at other times, and also the joy and total irreverence and livelihood at other times, create this huge contrast in these swings that, like I said, contribute to this manic-depressive nature of the film in some ways. You couple this with the kind of visceral power of knife throwing, which I'll get into a little bit more, but knife throwing, and you get a film that is remarkably, I guess visceral is the word, a film that is remarkably potent, I guess. This, I think, falls into a category of movies that sort of make the spiritual concrete. What do I mean by that? Well, there are a number of movies out there that might be about really wild things. They might have extremely weird and out there plots, but for one reason or another, they seem to resonate quite deeply. For one reason or another, they seem to be about something in here, or something up here, or something like that. They seem to be relatable, even though we aren't knife throwers, even though we haven't gone through all this stuff. And I think one way to think about these sometimes is that they, like I said, make the spiritual, make the internal concrete, some sort of big metaphor or something like this. If not a metaphor exactly, there's some sort of resonance in between the extreme things of the film and the extreme things that happen up here, because generally our lives in our heads and hearts are extreme one way or another, even if our external lives are extremely boring. Internally, things tend to be sort of extreme. One movie that I think falls into this category completely is Love Exposure, the crazy 4-hour-long Sion Sono film, which is a really interesting movie that's mostly complete garbage, with some cool music and some vibes thrown in, that ends up being a hugely sort of relatable movie, sort of, even though it's about just completely wild and bizarre things. This movie, I think, is in a similar category, where it seems deeply compelling, deeply potent, deeply visceral, deeply resonant, despite not being very relatable, literally. Okay, so let me go a little bit more into how knife throwing works in this. Essentially, knife throwing is an intimate act in some ways, and it's an intimate act of faith. So this movie really centers around luck. Luck is a huge part of this thing. Daniel Otey's character seems particularly interested in Vanessa Paradis because he deems that she is lucky. He deems that with her around, the knives will always go to the right place, and he places the secret in knife throwing not on the person throwing the knife. It doesn't matter who's throwing the knife so much as it matter who's having the knives thrown at them. If he's throwing the knives at her, he knows that he won't miss because she is lucky. Interesting. In some ways, this is an exploitative relationship, you may have already guessed, where he is to some extent leeching on the energy of the young woman or something like that, putting her life at risk for his entertainment, for some sort of masculine conquest in some ways, throwing the knives. This movie, generally speaking, the obvious parallel that probably don't even need to mention it if you've seen the movie, is that this movie, generally speaking, seems like it's about relationships, or at least one relationship. Now, I will say it leans perhaps on maybe anachronistic gender roles, which we will talk about more in the end, but just bear with me for now. Essentially, you have a slightly manipulative, exploitative man looking for some sort of tenderness or something like that, looking for some sort of look, looking for something to throw his knives at, right? And through that, a bizarre symbiosis being formed, a relationship where the two actually come together one way or another, and both get something out of it. Interesting idea, but like I said, perhaps one giant metaphor for a certain kind of relationship. Let me mention that this movie has one of the best scenes I've ever seen in any movie, is in this movie, Girl on the Bridge. It's a scene that happens maybe about a third of the way into the movie, and all I'll say is that it involves blind knife throwing. And this is the first time you're introduced to the song. I think it's called Who Will Take My Dreams Away, which is the song that was written for City of Lost Children. That might make sense if you've seen that movie and the title. And is, like I said, Angelo Badalamenti, I think that's how you say his name, and Marianne Faithfull. Really cool song that is used extremely well in this. Now, the song is reused a couple more times later on, which is maybe you lose points to some extent there. The other scenes I don't think are quite as potent as the first one, which, like I said, is one of the greatest scenes I've ever witnessed in terms of its intensity. You may forget to breathe during this scene, but also its intimacy, right? Knife throwing in the movie, beyond being metaphorical, also has a huge dramatic power, right? It's a very dramatic event to see him throwing the knives and whatever. Suspenseful, keeps you on the edge of your seat while also being fairly meaningful. This scene is just great. I mean, I would almost recommend just watching that scene. If you can't bring yourself to watch the movie, at least watch that scene. It's really, really great. Incredible style, incredible music. An incredibly good scene. After the knife throwing, it's common for Vanessa Paradis' character. She may be unscathed coming out from the knives, more or less, but usually she has one little cut here or here somewhere where a knife has just grazed her, right? She puts on a Band-Aid, covers it up like it's no big deal, and things keep rolling. But you wonder, for instance, if this is this kind of relationship, this odd symbiosis. Well, there is some cost to her, isn't there? There is some nick that she's picking up each time, some sort of lasting damage. Interesting. So there's more to talk about, I think, to some degree with that relationship angle of it. But I think you probably get the idea. And the point is not for me to extol all of my thoughts. I think the point is maybe to prime somebody who might be watching this movie, about to watch it, or to confirm to somebody who just watched it that they saw the movie the same way that I did. I think that this angle of the film is pretty obvious, and really you don't need me to tell you about it, hopefully. but it's something to think about. Now, I did mention a little bit that there's some elements of an anachronism in this film. And like I said, in some ways, this relationship is kind of a dated thing. And one thing that really hits this home is at the beginning of the film, this interview portion, you hear Vanessa Paradis' character explain sort of her history with men. And essentially you learn that it's a long history. I guess you could say she's somewhat promiscuous or something along those lines. And this is kind of interesting, and it might get the movie going off on the wrong foot for a lot of people for one of two reasons. Either more traditional people might think, this character isn't living life properly or whatever, and might find it hard to relate to that or something like that, might look down on her, might make some moral judgment about her. Now, people who are going to think that, this very dark comedy is not for them. Okay. The second thing, which might be more common, and is what I talk about when I mention anachronism, is that people might look at this and think, this is a bit of a one-dimensional character here. This is a bit of a... I'm not so interested in watching a movie where a woman is made out to look so one-dimensional or something along those lines, so foolish, so naive. I think that is maybe a reasonable reaction to the opening of the film. And like I said, this relationship of the slightly exploitative, slightly manipulative man looking for the lucky, the tender, so that he can throw knives at her, is kind of dicey in some ways. On the other hand, I would say to have patience. Some things happen in the final third of the movie that might turn the tables a little bit. It's also worth digging into the knife throwing thing a little bit too. There's a lot you could make of that. You could come away. Some people might come away with this movie and from this movie saying, well, yeah, there's men for you, just throwing the knives, unfeeling, unsensitive, exploitative, or something along those lines. I don't think that's quite the right reading of the film, but I can see how you would get there. Other people, so it could be that they think, wow, this is a great, really progressive movie, radical feminist movie or something like that. Or people could come away and think that the movie is sort of endorsing that kind of relationship and saying, oh, well, it's okay if you're married to somebody who just throws knives at you all the time, metaphorically or otherwise, and also be put off like that. So I don't really, I'm not going to stake a claim one way or the other, but I say that it's anachronistic only because that early scene sort of throws things off balance and puts some of these questions in play that otherwise might not be. It introduces ways to get a little bit distracted and to come away with something other than what you think. And I think in some ways that's kind of the way that anachronism goes in movies a lot of the times. Yes, there are many old movies that are like actively sexist and racist and whatever, and that's a certain kind of anachronism. But another kind of anachronism that's a lot more common in the sorts of movies on this channel that I watch and review is just something that slips into the movie that is going to distract people, essentially, and send them the wrong way. And that doesn't mean that we should ignore it or something like that, but that's why I bring it up, because this opening scene and some of the other details could sort of unbalance your view of the film in certain ways. But like I said, I think the actual viewpoint of the movie is complicated. And so if you find yourself being unbalanced, I would just say take a breath and, watch the whole movie, first of all, and give the director, Patrice Leconte, a little bit of credit, even if he doesn't deserve it, and think about maybe his view on exactly your concerns or something along those lines. Because I do think that there's room to wiggle on this type of relationship or whatever. Okay, so maybe the anachronism thing isn't interesting to you at all, or I don't know. But I thought it's worth mentioning. Overall, I think really, really a great movie, Girl on the Bridge. I suggest watching this. Like I said, a dark comedy, maybe not for everybody, I guess, but I think this is a pretty widely applicable movie. There are a couple of, why is it only 7.5? There are a couple of things here and there, like the beginning, like I said, is a little bit odd. Maybe it doesn't need to be there. The end is a little bit rushed in some ways. Just like the last sort of 10 minutes of the movie or something like that. A little bit rushed, not quite as strong a conclusion as the rest of the movie. But in general, I think almost anyone would probably feel like they got their money's worth with this movie. Perhaps it also pays a little bit of a tax just for being kind of a weird, out there, experimental film. But in general, I would recommend Girl on the Bridge to almost anyone. I think it's an interesting movie with a really great style, really unpredictable, pretty cool music. I will say, one other note about the music is that there's a lot of interesting music in this movie. There are also a couple of songs that are a little bit more standard sort of picks, like the song Sing, 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 shows up in this movie. That shows up in a lot of movies that want some sort of swing, big band kind of song in them. Okay, do you lose points for that? Well, I don't know. But worth mentioning. Otherwise, the score is really, really cool. Overall, really cool, stylish, interesting movie that actually has some substance as well. And like I said, that has one of the best scenes that I've ever seen, about 1/3 of the way into the movie. So I think definitely worth checking out, Girl on the Bridge.